Welcome back to Automation Stage. And now we have another presenter, Martin Gijsen, automation strategist at Puppet, and he will be talking about the secrets of pyramids. And Martin is in IT for 25 years and he calls himself an automation in testing strategist and he prefers his motorcycle over his car. So that's an interesting fact, and I wouldn't blame him for that. So, Martin, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Nikolai. The the secrets of the pyramids. The pyramids have always intrigued us, and even though my business is automation, I'm also interested in the pyramids. And I would like to tell you a few of the things that I have discovered about pyramids. Starting with the Pyramid of Gizeh, who was that was built for what that is the biggest pyramid that we currently have, and we know about this pyramid, why it was built, we know who had it built, we know more or less how it was built, all because of certain research that was done over many years. So we have learned a lot, and the pharaoh who is in there was buried together with a lot of other people, and I hope, in fact, that um, he was right in bringing all those servants with him, because if they actually leave in the afterlife, he will have a lot of cleaning to do, which he's not used to doing by himself, of course. But that's not the pyramid you came for. You came for this pyramid, probably. That's probably what you had in mind that I would be talking about. This is the classic test automation pyramid that Mike Cohn presented in 2009 in an article, a blog article, and later he did the same in the book that he wrote, which is called Succeeding with Agile. Of course, this is not really a pyramid, it's called a triangle, but with a bit of imagination, we can see a pyramid in it. I've always found it a bit confusing though. You know why? It's about the naming of the various layers in here. Because when I see unit, I think of the smallest thing that can be tested, which is a component in the software. When I think of service, it can either be a component again, a service that can be invoked, or it can be an interface to talk to that component. The service is the way to talk to it. And a user interface sounds like a component again, but is also related to an interface again. So it's a bit of a confusing thing to me, and we'll come back to that. But first, I want to pass to another kind of pyramid, and that is the test pyramid. Because the test pyramid is just as interesting. There are several versions, actually. It's not a single one of them, and because the things that we build in software development, they have different layers. Again, with unit and modules and everything. Suppose that we have a backend that might have a number of layers, the units that the developers build, the module that is constructed from it, multiple units together form one unit module, and that would be integrated into a service, perhaps in the backend, and all of that together works together in some way, and it constitutes a whole subsystem, which we call the backend. If we have microservices, it's similar, but then the subsystem uses orchestration, and that's somewhat different than classic backends. If you think of a database, there's a similar kind of construct there also. The services there are, of course, not the services that you have for a backend, as in REST services, they would be the queries. But there's a layer on top of that still that is, for instance, concerning how the processes running in the background, scheduled activities, would work together with the queries or affect the queries that the database logic, because there can be a lot of stored procedures and other logic in the database, how they work. And finally, the front end in structure, I guess, is a bit simpler, and they don't actually have services, but the actual front end interface. And over all of that, over a number of these subsystems, you would have um, your system that combines all of them into the functionality that the system is supposed to provide, integrates all of this, because all of this is about the integration of larger and larger components eventually into the system that offers the value that we're hoping for. And um, and that relates also to how we do strategy, test strategy. Because in those layers, we might have something that is really important and we want to test it completely from the lowest layer from the units all the way to the very top. Cool, fine. But in our test strategy, we might also feel that some things are not quite as important. And we can plot that actually on our pyramid here in an abstract way. Because if we have something that is really, really interesting to make sure that the units, the dev side, the developer side, the code is very well tested, we might feel that for this particular system, for whatever reason, it is not quite as important to test the higher layers as much. We prefer to focus on something else. Or we might say that for some functionality, which is not quite as interesting, perhaps not customer facing, but more internal, we don't really want to bother so much with the lower layers, but we focus on the higher levels. That can be a perfect valid test strategy if we think about it and we make these choices. That can be totally fine. There's one thing though about test cases. They tend to they have the nature of bubbling up a little bit. Test cases can be tested and possibly should be tested at a level where the functionality that we want to test is realized. So if the functionality that we want to test is realized at the unit level, take for example, we have a mortgage system. A mortgage system has the calculation for the whole payments for the next 20 or 30 years that you're going to be that you will have the privilege of having that mortgage. So that payment is implemented probably in a relatively small part of the payment schedule is realized in a relatively small part of the code in a class, let's say. You could, of course, test it at the top level. As a user, I'm interacting, I'm entering all sorts of data, and I see what kind of proposal, what kind of payment scheme I would receive. It's perfectly possible to test it there. But that's not where it's implemented. It's implemented all the way down there. And once we test it already in a unit test or a module test, things will be a lot faster, a lot easier. And then in the higher layers, we focus on the remaining risks, which helps us because we don't do things double and things also are executed faster. It will give a boost to reliability. So what happens is that as people, as human beings, we might prefer to do things in some other way. We still want to do the testing of the calculation, the mortgage calculations, the schedule in the system itself through the user interface. This is not so strange. It's a natural inclination, I guess, that we have. And it may not be so bad if we are performing all testing manually, but it also can become an issue, and there I will return to that shortly. Now, if you look at the classic test automation pyramid as it is depicted in the original picture that I showed you earlier, It says unit, service, and UI. And I mentioned that it was a bit confusing to me. It always has been until recently, because I was wondering, is this layering, is it about components or is it about interfaces? So I asked, and the answer that I got from the author himself was actually we didn't really think about that so much when I created this picture. And then when you have that in mind and you read the book, then you find that actually the focus is on the interface. And then you see that really the lowest layer is about the code interface to a to the unit or the module. It's the interface that determines that layer. You can only invoke it through code. Then on top of that, what is called the service layer originally is about ways for machines to talk to your system under test. That can be a service, that can be a message, it could be a database query, but machine-oriented interfaces. And at the top, you have the person, the people, the human interfaces, which is represented by UI. And it could actually also include file interfaces in this case, because the a different perspective on the whole thing, which is a very common one to take, is the speed perspective. The reason why it's so interesting to have this pyramid for most people, for many people, is because of the speed of the tests that are written at this particular level using these interfaces, human-oriented, machine-oriented, or code-oriented interfaces. Because some are really fast, some are really slow, and the really slow ones slow you down, so you don't want to have too much of that. Actually, the book says we want to have as little as possible of these. And that is a very valid consideration, and it is especially a valid consideration in the context of that book. Because the book is about agile software development. Agile and DevOps software development have as a focus to have a focus for automation to have fast feedback. Fast feedback will require fast tests. So you want a lot of fast tests and only a few slow tests, while still collecting the information that the test should provide for you. But there are also other factors, of course, relevant here. For instance, in the book, it is also mentioned that the reason to do it this way is not just speed of execution. It is also the brittleness of UI tests. The tests that go through a user interface tend to be more subject to change and take more effort to change. And also just only creating the tests tends to be a lot more work, and maintaining them as well when they are at the UI level. So those are other factors that are not so much related to test execution, but do affect the team because it takes time. There's actually an interesting link between the two pyramids that we saw, because the system, the unit to system scale that you have in the test pyramid is of course a different kind of animal than the one that we saw in the automation pyramid, which I have here presented in this way with the code machine person angle. But actually there are clear correspondences, because the code interface is of course what we use for the units and the modules, and that's what the developers normally take care of because it requires coding skills. Doesn't mean that testers cannot be involved in that, in either reviewing them or even creating them, but usually it's considered a developer skill and task, which is not really a bad thing. As for the machine interface or interfaces, those test cases have a place in that pyramid, but it's not the complete width of the pyramid as in the base, because unit and module tests are actually always automated. But there would be only a section of the subsystem and the service layer test would be automated in this manner. And um, at the UI level, at the person level, you are higher up in the pyramid. Of course, in the service level, there is no UI. And there's a section, some section, maybe smaller than this, maybe larger than the way it's currently depicted. But that's where you would you have your UI-oriented tests. And the rest that is not covered here is tests that are not automated. And of course, you would have plenty of those besides the other test activities that besides execution that cannot possibly be automated, or at least not at this time. So there's a clear link between these two, even though they are give a completely different perspective on the things. Now, the thing with automated tests being bubbling up into our testing, so going up into our later test phases, is of course that it's taking more and more time when it's not really necessary. And we would want to push them down. Otherwise, you get the so-called ice cream cone. It's still a pyramid, but it's not the flavor that most people would like to see. There's also different versions, and also those, in those cases, you could push down your test cases by selecting the layer at which the functionality that you're trying to test is implemented, which is also what the test pyramid already told us. Basically, if it's something that is composed of other components, and this is where it comes together, and this is where new functionality is created, then that is where you can test it. And it has certain advantages to do just that. The reason, or at least one of the reasons, probably the main reason why automated tests tend to bubble up more than is a good idea, is possibly because of the skill level of the people who are involved. Below the solid line is, well, what we call the developer tests, and that's where automation is not really an issue. The skills are there because they are developers. Code is what they do. Above that line, the system has some kind of interface. It can be a service, it can be a UI, it can be whatever. But it is possible for someone without coding knowledge or without using code to interact with the system and thus test it. And so we do that. But because many people entering the automation field at least start out with not much development experience and knowledge, they tend to do what they can do, which is going through some other interface, which is actually reserved or meant or part of a higher level layer. So an important part of making sure that the pyramid is effective for you and actually becomes a pyramid with the advantages that we have discussed is that the people working on automation have the necessary skills. So I encourage everyone to consider who in their organization, in their team, can use more experience and perhaps pair with them to build up that skill and make sure that the automation that you're doing as a team or as an organization is more effective towards the goal that you have for automation. And there's a bit of confusion that I notice when it comes to the goal of automation. Because people would often, like this picture is a bit confusing. You first you think, wait, is there a strange angle to this picture? We are seeing it from a slanted angle, but actually the window is exactly the way it seems, which you see by the reflection. Um, the window really is a bit weird. What you see is really what it's like. And um, automation raises some questions because at some point people ask, yeah, but automation is about speed, right? So that's what we do it for, speed. And actually, I would say no, not necessarily. First of all, automation, if you would do it and you do it at the same speed as it would go manually, for whatever reason, then it can still be a good idea to do it. And if you do speed up with automation, it doesn't have to be for the sake of speed per se. The use of automation doesn't have to be for speed if it is faster. There can be different reasons to do your automation. Yes, speed is a very valuable thing that is at the basis of lots of the value that you get from it, but it's not the only thing you can use it for. Because another context than the one that Mike Cohn is thinking of in his book, an agile or DevOps context, and perhaps even in that context, you could end up using a different kind of pyramid. Still a pyramid, but not necessarily the same one. Because the question then becomes, what is the main goal, a business-oriented goal of your automation? It could be, for instance, as it was mostly 20 years or so ago, it could be focused more on cost. If you're not a very agile organization, it could very well be that cost is an important factor and you want to focus on reducing cost. Does that give the same kind of pyramid? Not necessarily. It will give you, your goal will drive the choices that you make in your whole automation effort, but it can be oriented on a different goal. Likewise, you can have as a business-oriented goal, which you really should have, quality, primarily quality. Speed is nice, but quality is much more important in some cases. Or you can have a number of varieties of speed, one of which is fast feedback, which we know from the classic pyramid, because that is what Agile and DevOps love so much. But it could also be that your automation really is about, if you have a single story, you want that single story to production as fast as humanly possible. That is the focus for whatever business-oriented reason. Or you just want to maximize the amount of storage you do in a particular period of time, say a sprint. Those are business-oriented goals which give different choices in various areas and can deliver different kinds of strategies and also pyramids. As one example, suppose that quality is our main goal. We don't care so much about speed for whatever reason or cost. Then it could very well be that the focus of the testing and therefore also the automation is on the financial side of the system, because that's where all the money comes in. That's where the money is made. That has to be perfect. Then there's, let's say, a provisioning area of the system. Yeah, that should work pretty well, but it's not really as important. And as for the web application, that's the kind of software that we can update like that. So if we find an issue there, we can just fix it very quickly. The impact is not so much. We don't care as much about that. We don't need too much automation for that. If something goes wrong, we'll just fix it. Different goal, different angle on your automation, different strategy, and a different pyramid. Now, how does this relate to the automation, this having different layers and perhaps pushing down towards the lower layers? How does that relate to test cases becoming more technical and agile specification techniques such as behavior-driven development, BDD? Well, if you take just one simple example, Given a customer with an account, when the customer receives an amount over 10,000, then he's flagged for investigation because of fraud possibilities, for instance. How would you execute this test if you automate it? Well, you could probably do it through a user interface, sure. But you could just as well do it through services towards the backend and perhaps some queries towards the database directly to retrieve information rather than update it. That usually messes up a system big time, but queries are usually okay. So you have the freedom here to choose a number of interfaces. And why is it possible to do that? Because it describes the what of the system, not the how, which is quite valuable. And one of the reasons why writing these feature files ahead of time before the sprint and not during the sprint as test cases, where a lot of implementation details can find their way into them, into the acceptance criteria, is a really good idea. Write them ahead of time as proper specifications and acceptance criteria. Of course, there's more to strategy than this automation pyramid. And since I think I have some more time, I'll do that. I'll discuss that for a little bit, because besides this whole pyramid stuff, there's lots of other topics that are of interest to us, lots of them. And actually, all of those are relevant to the choices that we make, but it's a bit of a mess. And we need a bit of order that will help us guide us. And so that's actually not so hard if you think about it, because if you look at what we do, how we develop software, we have people with certain skills that need training and that operate in a certain culture. Then they create the test cases, the automation for it. They create the system and the test environments, and everything around it. And when creating those, they use certain techniques. And when they have created them, they use that in execution. And execution involves also test data management, what test environments you have, what interfaces you talk to. So that's a special area also where the actual execution happens, continuous integration. And of course, creating it and the interaction between them is the processes that they work with. And all of it happens in the context of an organization that should tell them what they are expecting of them, on the one hand, which should also enable them to do that by giving them the support, the coaching, the whatever it is that they need to do their job. So we have identified 5 areas that are pretty much separate from each other and can be used to split up the field of automation and testing. And then you get something like this. I've added here understanding as a more theoretical area of what people need to know, what everyone should know about automation. But besides that, there is automation as a product, which is the organization side of things, organization treating automation as a product. Then understanding, people, process, execution, and technology, or actually techniques. And the nice thing about this is that it spells as an acronym Puppet. So, which makes it easier to remember. But now a little more detail. What is involved in each of these 5 areas? Well, this is my complete picture. And understanding here on the right gives you a number of statements. This is important to know. But you will see that the other 5 areas, product, people, process, execution, and techniques, they don't tell you what to do. They only ask questions. Why? Because that context is so immensely important to know all sorts of things about your strategy, to decide on all sorts of areas. And if you consider what we've discussed earlier about the pyramids, then we've mentioned that automation must support testing. The automation should be following the testing strategy and approach, not being an effort in itself, which is independent and perhaps even more important than the testing. It shouldn't be. You've mentioned also a bit about scope and about that main goal that you want to have identified. We have asked how can we talk to the system, because there can be multiple interfaces that we might use. We have spoken about how to write tests and when to write them, and what to automate when, perhaps. And finally, we have also mentioned that people have their own skills. They need to be built up, because with the right skills, the right level of skills, and perhaps cooperation, you can do them. You can do the automation most effectively. You have as little technical debt, because basically that's what it is. If you end up with an upside down pyramid, with the skills that you really need. And that brings me to the conclusion of my slides. And my humble suggestion to you is that your automation strategy and your automation pyramid should be in line with what is your test strategy, starting from your business-oriented goal, because the context that the original pyramid was created for is not necessarily the one that you work with or work in. And if you want to complete your automation strategy, because there's a lot more to strategy in automation than a pyramid, interesting as it is, as demonstrated by the Puppet overview, then look at all these questions and ask yourself these questions. Some will not be so relevant. Well, then you can just put them aside. But making sure that you touch on all those topics will make sure that you will have a good picture of where it is you're heading for, and that will guide your choices in many areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin, for this presentation. We do have some questions, and if there is still some time to add them, so please, if you have any questions, you can still add them to the Q&A session. So let's start with the first one. What do, in case if you started on the project when testing was performed only on UI level before?
Very practical question, something that no doubt other people will recognize as well. And well, you could go to your product owner, assuming that you're working in a team, and say, you know what, let's not make anything for the next half a year and do only test automation. Chances are that the product owner has other priorities that he wants to have handled as well. So in few cases that might work, if it's really bad, if something is really bothering you as an organization, but probably that's not going to happen. So the more practical approach is usually the what is often called the Boy Scout rule, which is from the Pathfinders I think from America, and they say, leave the camping ground a little cleaner than you found it. So do a little bit every time. And that you can do in a, well, basically under the radar, just do a little bit as part of every story. Okay, I'm now working on this particular file, this particular functionality, this feature. Let's make a few test cases for this, and let's make a few for that. And then bit by bit, you build up your automation, your test cases, and you get value from it. It will not be fast, but the impact will be limited. Again, this is a strategic choice. How do you want to do this? Where is your value? Is your value in getting to the market fast and first get that feature out? Then probably that should have priority. But if you really need a sustainable development project and your automation is going to be an important part of that, then you have to make sure that it happens. It can be that you can talk to your PO and discuss it with him or her and get it actually prioritized by the PO. to some extent. Again, not everything in one go, but bit by bit, it can be part of the product backlog, prioritized properly. A last approach, besides simply doing it, not asking the product owner at all, which is, well, not necessarily the best approach, but what sometimes people do. Another way is to put the stories on the backlog as a team, because the product backlog doesn't only contain the product owner's items, right? It can also contain the stories of the team, stories that are focused on the team and on the development approach that the team has. And if the team is mature enough to decide, as it's supposed to do, to decide what it takes into a sprint, so not have stories pushed down their throat by a product owner, but knowing what the priority is of the business-oriented story, but also considering for themselves, these are the stories that we want to do, and automation is part of that, and we want to do some of that. And then you can say as a team to your product owner, yes, these features are important. We know that, we respect that, and we accept that, and we want to work this way. And we also, to support our work so that we can create those features, we need to work on this. So we are just going to do some of this. That might give you, if the product owner is not so accustomed to getting, well, basically no for an answer to getting the full sprint for himself or herself, then it might get you some discussions. But that is, as I understand it, especially if you read the principles behind the Agile Manifesto, that is the way how Agile can really work well. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I fully agree with you, and hopefully the Matt got his, no, not Matt, Vyacheslav got his answer. Okay, so the next question, Matt is asking how we can apply testing pyramid to backend testing.
Sorry, apply test what to backend testing?
How we can apply testing pyramid to backend testing.
Yeah. All right. So a backend may not have a user interface, which is also one of the things that puzzled me about the original pyramid, because it talks about a UI at the top. What if your system doesn't have a UI? Some systems just don't. And that's exactly why I like the view of you have human interfaces, machine interfaces, and the code interface. And you can apply the pyramid to your particular context when you know what your goal is. If your goal is to be very fast, then you will focus on what executes fast, which is the same thing that the classic automation pyramid does, but that includes a user interface. If you don't have a user interface, and speed is still your main goal, you can think about, okay, how do I speed up test execution if fast feedback is what you want? You don't need a user interface to do that. You just apply it from the underlying principle rather than the precise picture as it is in the book. What is your goal? If that is speed, do that. But for instance, if your testing is actually slowed down mostly because setting up the test environment, especially the data, always takes days to do because you have to do it by hand, then you know what? Perhaps not execute any test cases at all. Focus your effort on making sure that the process of the provisioning of the test data to prepare your test environment, that is taken care of. Is that test automation in the classic sense? No. Is it automation in testing, the application of tooling to support your testing process? Yes. Is it valuable? Perhaps it's the most valuable thing that you can do in a particular context. So again, with that goal in mind, what is it that you're trying to achieve? What is it that the business will be happy with? To give an example, suppose that you have as a goal for automation, yes, we want 100% regression test automated, the standard one that you hear, automate all the things. Suppose you have that, and you go then to the business, the product owner, or someone working with the system, and say, you know what, we have 100% regression test coverage. They'll look at you and say, yeah, and why is that important to me? Because it isn't. It's a means to an end, and it's the goal that the business will be interested in. So let's focus on that goal and find a way to achieve that. And you might not actually have automated test cases and a test pyramid at all if you do that. But anyway, what you will do is focus on value for your team and for your product owner and the business and the customers. And that's basically what I believe that we should be doing.
Yeah, makes sense. The next question next is um, Martin is asking, in your opinion, more or less end-to-end tests? I mean, oh, it jumped. More or less end-to-end tests. I mean, replacing them with, the example, contract tests and only minimal end-to-end tests just to test the happy path.
Well, of course, I risk becoming a bit monotonous here, but focus on the value, focus on the goal. I know of one bank in the Netherlands that has totally stopped having end-to-end test environments, as far as I know. What they do is good testing in the teams. They use contract-based testing to do kind of initial integration test to prepare for integration, technical integration, and then they push to production, as far as I know. So that requires that the testing ahead of that point is pretty good. Otherwise, you won't find the other issues. It requires good specifications so that you do the right thing. And once all of that is in place, apparently for some organizations, it is possible to not do end-to-end testing at all. But again, what are you doing it for? If your goal is speed, bringing as much stuff as possible to production, or bringing individual stories as efficiently to production as possible, then end-to-end may not be necessary. And actually, it's usually a huge pain, mainly because of, often because of test data issues, because you need your test data in place in all of the environments and in sync, because otherwise your test will fail, and if your test fails, it's worthless. It tells you nothing. If it fails for the wrong reason, such as test data. So think of what you're trying to achieve. It could be that end-to-end testing is very important for your situation. For instance, if the testing at earlier levels is not quite as good that you would rely on that for total software quality. But perhaps you come to a point where you can have less of it, and especially contract-based testing will take care of a lot of the integration issues that can happen. So that can be a really useful way to at least work towards less end-to-end testing. Because basically, if you can push tests down, you probably want to do that. It will require building up the skill to do it, just like starting with contract-based testing. It's new, so it's something that we have to learn. But if the value is there, let's follow the value.
Yeah, totally agree with following the value because, well, at the end of the day, it's a business, and well, if we need to bring value as well, just to make it sustainable.
I like my work, so I like to do automation for myself. But indeed, at the end of the day, I'm really doing it for someone else who's paying me to do this. So I probably should think about them a little bit too.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, and that's it for our time for Q&A session. Unfortunately, not all the questions are answered, but maybe you can write the questions directly to Martin, and maybe he will answer them. So thank you, Martin. Thank you, everyone who participated in this session. We will now have an hour break for an hour for a lunch break, and then we come back in 14:40 and have a panel discussion, the future of test automation. So I'm looking forward to seeing you there, and have a nice break.